tools to succeed.
They will strive.
We will strive.
They will thrive.
We will thrive.
They will rise.
Yes, we will. We're elevating futures. When we're elevating futures. Futures, yeah.
My guest today is Laura McBain, the Managing Director and Co-Director of the K-12 Lab at the Hasso Plattner Institute of Design at Stanford. With over 25 years of experience in educational leadership and school transformation, she is a designer and educator focused on using human-centered design to provide equitable and innovative educational experiences. Laura, welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, Dr. Perryman. It is a pleasure to be on the call and excited to talk to you today, calling in from Palo Alto, California, and a real honor to be on the show with you today.
Well, thank you. And we are so excited to dig in to the content because we know you have so much to share. So let's start at the beginning. Tell us about your personal and professional journey and how you became the managing director and co-director of the K-12 Lab.
Oh, Tracee, how much time we got? Life is always full of serendipities. I will tell you a little bit about myself, and that might explain the journey as we get into it. As someone who background on me is that I, didn't think I would fall into education, to be clear. I went through undergrad and didn't know what I wanted to do. I was an English major. I political science and Spanish, and I was like, "What am I going to do with them? Become a lawyer?" I just didn't know what I actually wanted to do. Um, and I think as I started getting older after graduation, I kept going back to, the question around what is my personal statement? What do I believe in? And what's kind of impact I want to make in the world? And so one of the things that I turn back to, so when I was quite little, and this is elementary school, I lived in DC, outside of DC, in fact. And one of the things that I did was I had a learning disability. I had an auditory processing disorder as well as a speech impediment. And so if you had asked me, 20, 30, 50 years ago, my name, I would have said Wawa. I couldn't say lunch. And so I struggled in school. And it wasn't until I would say, and I was very lucky, I would say, because I was born after the passage of IDA, which is a federal Disabilities Act that supports for young people across the nation, which is very important. And I'm very personally connected to that. And it's a beautiful bill that should be continuing to be supported. And I also knew that I got support. And I also knew there were other kids that were next to me that didn't look like me that did not get support. And perhaps because I was a white student, my parents were going to college, I wasn't performing at what they thought was the expectation for my gender, for my race in that community. And that kind of stuck with me. I would say I was pulled out. I had some stigma. I would sit in third grade when everyone was going to recess and doing the other things. I would sit with my packets with my kindergarten friend, and we would sit and do these reading exercises. And so I say this story to say is that where my journey started actually is understanding and feeling this question of feeling underestimated, of feeling this question that people have something in them, right? That we just can't know. And so my commitment, I guess, to education is grounded in my personal story around that. Is I think while I fell into education, I eventually got my teaching credential. I started teaching in Southern California. I taught AP European history. I started a charter school, and I worked as a founding teacher at High Tech High, helped build our graduate school. Um, and then eventually made my way to the Stanford d.school, serving as our K-12 director. But it's founded in this belief that I think we often underestimate the talents and abilities of our young people. And so education for me became this vehicle through which I can actually make a difference and ensure that the kids who weren't getting help next to me could get it, right? They can get the special ed needs as needed, but they can also feel not underestimated. They can feel like people believe in them, and they can feel like they have the agency to do things that people didn't imagine they could do. And so for design, for me, That is what design is about. It's about equipping people with the creative confidence, as we say, the agency to make a difference in the world. And so that's a long story. You probably didn't know this is where the story was going to go, but that is where my journey has always started in that core belief, and then also has continued throughout my life, regardless of the role that I'm in. It's about helping educators and anyone believe in the power of possibility within human beings and their capacity to do good in the world. And so my journey is, from teacher, principal, designer, is all about that. And honestly, it doesn't matter the role that you're in, but for me, that's my personal story about why and how I do the things that I do.
Well, it is an amazing story, and the passion resonates through the screen in a
Yeah,
powerful way. And
thank
so
you.
you're welcome. And so I would love to hear from you how you translate that passion and
Hmm.
these values and ideals into your work at K-12 Lab.
Yeah. So a lot of it is giving folks two things. Like design is about a mindset and a methodology, right? And so part of it is couple things. One is we believe in creating tools and experience that help people unlock, right, that creative spirit, that creative courage that is instilled in them as humans. We all have that in some way, shape, or form. Looking at the beautiful artwork behind you, all have that. And so some of it is learned by doing. So we do those type of deep learning experiences as designers. We create activations where people can tinker themselves with new tools of design. So we create learning experiences, tools, and programs to help people uncover, right, this creative courage that they have within themselves, and then give them the tools to think about how do they make change in the world? How do they bring other people in? And so what that looks like within the K-12 lab and at the D.school is sometimes it's professional learning experiences, sometimes it's webinars, sometimes it's full-blown 3-day activations at South by Southwest where we'll have an immersive food truck that we turn into an escape room to challenge people's assumptions on test scores about what testing needs to look like in schools. So we do both mindset work, which is like, can I feel creative? Do I have the creativity to think of new ideas? And if so, how might I build those? And that's through prototyping, ideation, need finding, but really centered on this question about like, how do I learn more with my community in new and novel ways that create things that did not exist before?
Okay, so tell me then, how about some model programs or model
Yeah.
projects that you've seen emerge from your work?
Yeah, I mean, I'll give you a couple different examples. I'll give you 3. 3 different kind of shades of programs. One, as I mentioned, so a couple years ago, pre-COVID, I don't know if we're still in COVID or not in COVID. Nobody knows which stage you're in, right? But we were wondering about this question around assessment. How do we actually measure collaborative problem solving? If you're doing any type of work in schools beyond, traditional test taking, everyone goes, well, how do you measure collaboration? How do you measure, collaborative communication? What does that look like? And so we started working on, because we're kind of nerds, I will say, to be really clear, a lot of us fell in love with like escape rooms. And we had this, again, thinking differently, if you will, is what's interesting about an escape room, and you might have done one yourself, I imagine, or know what they are. Is, they're 40 minutes, 60 minutes where you have to work with others to solve a problem. Pretty simple. And so we started prototyping. Well, what if we actually created an experience where educators can think about what are I would say, the behaviors that they're hoping they would embody or look for when people are engaging in collaborative problem solving. And what a really fun way to do it via an escape room. And so that project we worked on, we brought a colleague of ours who were really interested in escape rooms, and we designed a mobile puzzle bus where we actually built a escape room inside of a mobile food truck. And we took it around to South by, we took it to schools so that we can engage educators in a pre, during, and post experience about what does it mean to measure and understand the behaviors of collaborative problem solving. So that's one that looks at a bigger issue about how do we reimagine assessment. And then most recently, we looked at this question of scale. When you're trying to make change in school districts and communities, we often look outward. We don't assume that the innovation is in us and within us and within our community. And so we did, again, some research on that project and fell in love with the work of Monique Sternin. And she writes about positive deviance, which is how is it that one person or one group within a community is performing or doing better given the same resources and assets and allocations. And there's a lot of work in this arena. Actually, comes from my career work in the field as an anthropologist, looking at the Vietnam War, where like why did one group of families, why are the young people more nourished um, than another group of families? And so what we found was in this work called positive deviance, there are brilliance in every district, every community and school, but sometimes we brush over them. We kind of say, well, they're the outlier. And so we developed a toolkit that's around uncovering and finding the positive deviance folks within your own school districts and communities so that you can understand and get better at seeing innovation in the moment. How do you take the teacher that's just doing this great job and not saying, well, they're this amazing person? There's actual tools and mindsets and behaviors that this person does. And can we understand them better and not just replicate the teacher? Because we can't do that. But we can actually make the behaviors and the skills and the tools that they do more accessible to others and increase everyone based on the great work that's happening within a community, not from with outside.
That is extraordinary. Do you have any summary reports that
Oh,
kind
yeah.
of give us some themes as to what those prototypes might look like?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I can share in the chat at some point or part of this. I have not only what they look like, but also the toolkits that people can take and do it themselves. So our job is not just to do the work, but create accessible tools and resources where people can literally go build the escape room if I send you the link. It's on our website. Same thing with the positive toolkit. We have a thing you can download. It's free, it's highly accessible, and people can start doing this themselves. So all of those, it's not even just a report, but actually a field guide for people to actually engage in the work themselves. So I have those too.
That would be very helpful because in many conversations, I hear just what you spoke to. We
Yeah.
have phenomenal instructors or phenomenal leaders over here, but we don't know how to replicate their
Yeah.
impact. And so
Yeah.
I think that among all of the things that you provide, it will help with decision making
Yeah.
uh, for administrators and leaders if they have some guidance as to who to invest in
Yeah.
and the type of characteristics to uplift, incentivize, and reward.
That's right. And it's an interesting thing because, and I sent the link here and I'll give you the puzzle one in just a minute. Part of the challenge I think when we're thinking about educators and having worked in a lot of schools, is that sometimes the person that's doing some of the, like, most outlandish work who is a positive deviant, it's often countercultural sometimes. And we sometimes push back on that person and say, "Oh, they're just the out there person." And I think part of the incentivation is not just have to be metrics. Some of it is acknowledging that the person who's doing something different might have something to offer that kind of, I would say, subversive pushback on what's happening. We need to get better at noticing when those are really getting better at seeing them actually and honoring that person as like, oh, they're an innovator. They're just not that yes, they do great on the math scores. They do this thing, but they're actually an innovator. And so how to me is part of the mindset work is not just incentivizing people by celebrating their work, but actually like honoring that they are an innovator of what's happening in pedagogy and community and with students. And that is a fundamental that we don't often do.
Well, tell me this, how does a community, how does first of all, do you have to be a school district to become a part of your work, or how can organizations get involved or be studied or be included?
Yeah. I mean, one thing we can do, and I'm dropping some links in here for you all to see, is like anyone who's watching this podcast, let's just say, you're in already. You're in the fam. You're in. Like there's no barrier to entry. Everything about one of our sites and anything we put out is for public consumption. You can be a school district. You can be I would say the thing that we always love to say is like be interested in making change. It doesn't matter the role that you're in. We work with, of course, school districts and teachers, but educators in all types, in and outside school. We work with like out of school programs as well. Our colleagues down the street, Street Code Academy, that does amazing work with young people 8 to 80, helping everyone see themselves as technologists and learners. And so I say this to say is anyone can work with us. We are, the only requirement is that you're in, that you want to make change in your community and we'll do it together.
Okay. So when we think about the emphasis on STEM or STEAM and technology
Yeah.
and many debates that emerge, right? Like how
Yeah.
much should it be about the tech and how much should it be about human capital? How do you
Yeah.
balance those tensions in your work?
That is especially, it's a really great question, Dr. Perryman, because as the rate of emerging technology is coming, like we think about AI, think about gene editing. One of the other areas that we've worked on and I've worked on within the D.school is my colleague and I were just walking on the way over here. And we have an emerging tech portfolio of work of resources, which I'm also happy to share. They're also free and downloadable and usable. Um, I think there's a really important distinction between we think about STEM or STEAM or STEAMy, as everyone's like naming it different things, right? Whatever acronym you want to use for it. I don't know. I don't know where there's like scheme, I think is in there too. I don't know. There's so many different versions of this nowadays. But I think the fundamental thing is we have to shift from this concept that like science, technology, and STEM, and technology in there, we are all technologists, particularly today. Doesn't matter whether you're a history teacher, you are a math teacher, or whether you're an English teacher. All of us have the capacity to be technologists. And so in order to actually like think about your question, we have to reframe who is actually designing this stuff. Who is empowered to understand what it looks like? How do you break open, the algorithms and understand what those are? And I think that can happen in a technology class, but it also can happen in a social science classroom. And so I'll share what we call map the problem space is that we're talking about technology, we're talking about data. And who controls the data designs what the thing does. It's always about data. And data is the thing of when we're looking at our iPhones or we're looking at algorithms or we're looking at your TikTok feed, right? It's a little bit what we call like, I like to liken it to the matrix. Is once you see the algorithms in your life, you will be better informed about what's controlling you. And so I think there's two things. One is we all need to understand, I think, the core competencies of what these technologies are, whether it's AI, right? We're thinking about generative AI, whether it's gene editing, understanding that. We all have that capacity and should have that capacity to do that. And I'll share some work on this front in just a minute. But then the thing is like, it's not just understanding what it is. It's like, what are the long-term intended or unintended consequences of what this technology might do? Who might it benefit and who might it harm? Those are social science questions. Those are not technology questions. And I think sometimes we make these like binary things, but actually all of us are technologists. And as we see, AI taking over for coding and things like that, we need to understand what it is so that we know what questions to ask. My colleague Carissa Carter says that you don't need to be a coder to know what the code can do. And I think this is the moment that we're in, and I think a lot of us need to get better at looking at this and thinking about technology not from what the product is, but from a social science lens is like, what do we want it to be? What impact is it going to have? And how might we know?
And helping those who are in the social science arena advocate for themselves in this space because depending on which room you're sitting in,
Yep.
sometimes our social scientists get moved to the background, and that could be detrimental to the future of education and the future of our society if we lose sight of critical thinking and become too focused on the possibilities of what technology can do or what kind
Yes.
of conveniences it can afford.
Yeah. I mean, my colleague Katie Knight, who's at the Siegel Family Endowment, talks about technopragmatism, which is like tech is not always the answer. Sometimes it's a more human answer. And I think you're exactly right. I think, and I shared some of our work here. I love algorithms, which is a game board that people can take up. But the quintessential thing in that game that we design, and again, it's free, people can take it, is thinking about these first, second, third order change. Is like, if you do this, what might be the consequences? First, 1 year out, 2 years out, what systems might it radically imagine? And I think that social scientists, to your point, are very unique to ask those questions and need to be in the conversation, not just when it's developed, not in the aftermath, but in the design phase of what we're designing. Like they have to bring that lens. And I think at the D School, one of the things that we always do and pride ourselves in is the unique collaboration between folks who are working in education, technology, thinking about social sciences. We actually think that is a really interesting group of people to come together, that diverse perspectives, device lived experience, expertise, that type of thing actually should be what a good design team is. It's not just technologists designing on their own without the voice and without the voice and wisdom, if you will, of some of the social scientists.
Absolutely. And speaking to voice, I think is a good segue to talk about parents.
Yeah.
In your work, how do you all engage parents in these conversations and in the long haul, right?
Yeah.
Of innovating and sustaining schools that are responsive to the 21st century needs of students and their families.
Yeah. I mean, I think this is the question. I mean, you're asking a really good question. I'm going to put up another thing that we did recently, I think about a year ago at the Smithsonian, actually, um, that we engaged a whole bunch of people. Let's see if I can find it in just a minute. But where one of the things that we've been doing with parents in particular, and I would say intergenerational groups to be explicit, where we have young people and parents together, is one of our projects that we spent a lot of time with. Um, is thinking about what we call futures thinking, which is how do we think differently about the future? And one of the projects that we've run for the last number of years as part of that work is what we call a Hall of Descendants. And we work with a lot of different futurists. And we have brought in parents as well as like young people to think about when they think about education or we talk about the future of learning. One of the challenges that I've noticed is that we think about the future of learning in the abstract. But we're not thinking about, well, no, this is my child's child. This is my partner's, this is my neighbor's child. And so sometimes I think what we actually help parents think about is how do we think about long-term legacy? How do we help them think through that, like, we want to meet the urgent need of our young people today, but we all need to be acting as if we are ancestors to their education community today. That is the key. And I think Roman Kisnarik's work, being a good ancestor, I think is a place to start with parents. Because when I've done this work, and I can share some more links, we have people create a physical portrait of their descendants. And we ask them four basic questions like, what do they love? What kind of world do they live in? What kind of values do they hold? And what do they need? And I will tell you, and I've done this, we did that at the Smithsonian. I've done this at South by Southwest. We've done this like all different variations with different types of communities on all different political spectrums, to be really clear. And what I find is that, like, at the end of the day, everyone wants their young person and their future young people, in any shade that we're talking about, like any different degrees of separation, to have confidence, to have creativity, to have empathy, to have the ability to shape their lives. So that is a universal need. And so when we actually can get to that core piece, we can actually start asking a different question about, like, if that's what we all want for our descendants in our community, what do we need to do today? What type of work? What does school need to look like and to embody that I think all of us want for the future that we're leaving behind? And so I think that's actually like where we can start with parents, because we could get into STEM and curriculum and things like that. But I think what we're asking is, like, what type of legacy do we want our communities to leave behind that will impact, the generations that the parents are also stewarding?
That is amazing. And tell me now, once you collect this data from parents, this information, what is the next step to combine that work or to infuse that work into the actual running
Yeah.
or administration of the schools where their children and grandchildren attend.
Yeah, so I'll put some more links in there, and I'll probably just, like, drop it in there because I think I'm just giving you one example, but we've got lots of different ways to think differently about how do you approach the future differently, um, and so I'll just drop some stuff in there, and you can kinda see our library, if you will, but often what we're doing with folks, and part of it is experiential futures or experiential, learning, is what people are designing, whether it's like a portrait, it might be a tour from the future. My colleagues design that, which is like, let's have a tour from a school in 15 years. What would that tour look like? What people are actually allowing what we call their preferred futures, right? We have our plausible futures, which is things we think will happen if nothing changes. We have our possible futures where the world can go. But ultimately, what we're trying to build are these preferred futures in our community. And everything, whether it's a tour from the future, a hall from descendants, whatever kind of activity that I just put in our chat here, they're visions of a future. They're just visions, right? And so the question we can start thinking as a designer is like, given that vision, what do we need to learn? Whom do we need to learn with more now? That's not included in that vision. And then what can we try? We apply a prototyping lens to that. If we have this vision of what we think is possible, and within those visions, I've seen, people having a deep connection to nature. I can't tell you how many times I've done this with like mixed groups, and they'll say that I want my students to be in nature more. And when I see those images and they will draw visions of their future, literally in prototypes, like very, very scrappy, within that is a prototype. Within that is an idea that actually could get starting to incubate, if you will. And so this is where design comes in. Is like we allow some of these futures thinking to like build our imagination, and then we can actually piece out, well, what in that could we start today? Could we start a program? Could we pilot? Could we prototype something where we can learn more now in order to make that vision and start working toward that vision now? And so some of that's the work that design does.
So, how do you then bring the students in?
Oh, it's the same processes. I don't think I've always been brought up when I teach, I was a founding teacher of High Tech High, and my dear mentor and colleague, Rob Reardon, who, he was part of the oldest public high school in the United States, which is Cambridge Ringe and Latin, and then helped us find one of the newer public schools in the United States. And I think sometimes we separate out the type of experiences for learners versus adults. And I think we should be asking the same type of experience. If we want our students to do it, we got to do it ourselves. That's the reality, right? And so part of it is a scaffolding question, but everything I've been describing, I've done with students too. They're no different. Like students have, going back to where we started today in the conversation, they have visions about what they want the future to be, and we need to be listening to them. And so they have visions of what they think schools need to look like, and we have an opportunity to listen. And so I think we should have I think we need similar structures for the audiences that we're serving, whether it's a teacher, a parent, a student, and then we can start building those together, and bringing those communities together. And I think from the student perspective, like their imagination is great. So let's lean into that. Let's listen to what they have to say and then find out what's not working for them.
So then tell me this. I'm sure that you assess data and input from students, and assess data input from parents, caregivers. Tell us a bit about the common threads that you see and then some of the
Right.
differences of what they report.
On which topic? On which arena?
In terms of just when you said you work with communities, with parents to get their voice and set their vision and future for what they want. And then with
Yes.
students, you also leaned into it's very important to see their vision for the future. So what would be
Yes.
the commonalities between their visions for the future and
Yeah.
what distinctions?
Oh, that's a good question. Sometimes they're not as different as you think. I think they're not that wildly different. I think young people want more freedom. They want more agency. They wanna have an opportunity to be more flexible and learn. Now, not surprising, we think about the world in which our young people are raising is the flexibility to have just-in-time learning, to explore things on their own pace. I'm seeing a lot of that is, like, we want, a lot of the young people that we've been interviewing, there's 2 things they're quite concerned about, I will say. One is, like, can they have more flexibility? Can they have more agency? Can they design their learning experiences more given that there are so many platforms and experiences, and if we look at video games or other analogies, that are already letting them do that. So, like, that's a big theme. We're seeing that already, right? And then I would think that the existential things that I hear for young people is climate. Is like there is definitely a feeling for young people today, particularly in the climate crisis that are happening around the country, like that seems to be a reoccurring theme, is how might we make change today within that arena in our community? That comes up a lot.
That's what I've seen as well.
Yeah.
And in terms of parents and caregivers, um, what are their thoughts about more agency? Are those showing up in their assessments, or are they
Yeah.
thinking from a more traditional perspective?
I mean, I think it ranges, I would say. I think it's a little bit of a range. I think they're not all that different. I think the question is like they want the agency, and at the same time, how do they ensure that young people are one of the things that I think they're worried, I would say as well, is like how might those pathways not become overly predictive? So one of the unique pieces about learning is that sometimes you love something because some teacher like a Dr. Perryman introduced you to this thing that you never thought you would be introduced to. And so that is the tension is like we want people to feel like they have the agency to explore the thing. And sometimes guided mentors, experienced teachers have the capacity to interject. And I'm sure you and I could talk about stories where we've done that with young people. And then that has opened up a different pathway for them. And so I think that's the area that I think the tension is like, particularly for young people who have not had a lot of experiences, they just keep going on the same path. So how do we ensure that like agency of like over relying on the path that they want doesn't become a predictive path based on their past? That's a question I have a lot.
Okay. Well, now look into the future. Where do you see the field of education heading over the next 5 to 10 years?
Oh, that's such a tough question. I don't know. I don't know. I really don't. I mean, I I don't know. Like, let's be honest. I think things are changing rapidly. I mean, there's a saying in futures that we often, um, I think, over predict the current moment and under predict the 10 years. We think in decades. People think in decades, 20s, 30s, 40s. So in the short term, we actually overly think that AI is going to go move really quickly. Um, and we think it's going to happen. But when you look past in 10 years, we often underpredict the radical changes that could happen. So there's a tension there. Like, I think back to like thinking about this. This came out in 2008. The world looked radically different in 2018. And so sometimes we have a tough job, I would say, visioning the future. And I think there's an area that I think is less about what the future of learning is. But I think as a designer, the question I ask is also what is the context in which we are building the future of learning with our young people? It's a different question because I think about we can probably make some good assumptions based on signals today and trends that we see an increase in climate changes around the globe that's happening in New York right now, it's happening in the West Coast, it's everywhere. And that is the context in which schools are operating. We're seeing the rise of emerging tech is not changing. So we're designing in the context of that. And we're also designing in a context in which communities are more siloed than ever before. This polarization that exists in the United States, right? And so when I think about the future of learning, the question is, how am I designing learning experiences in the context of these different trends around me? How do I make really learning meaningful that actually fits the context in which we are operating. So it's not about predicting what we think the future of learning might be. That is going to change, but our responsibility is to design meaningful learning experiences in the context of all these things happening around us. And that has always been the role of an educator. And that is where I think as educators, I think a lot of us have a fear about the future, like what's going to happen. But this goes back to agency. Actually, those are going to keep happening. The world is not getting less complicated, right? It's getting more complicated. And in fact, where we have the capacity is to start making projects on climate with young people, starting them to make with these emerging tech. We actually can do that right now in order to prepare for the context in which our young people are living in.
Awesome. Yes, you handled that question well because, with the rapid changes in technology, it's hard to predict anything.
Absolutely.
But you have to just be flexible and be able to adjust as
Yeah,
information is made available.
that's right.
So Tell me just personally in the work of K-12 Lab, what is the project that you're working on now that you
Mm,
really feel is
yeah,
meaningful to the overall movement? Tell us about that.
yeah. I mean, I kind of put it this like futures work I think is really interesting for me, I think from a personal perspective, because that project we're continuing to do work on, we're evolving it, we're gonna have another thing at South by Southwest. We've done a lot of work around the field. We're starting to work with communities next year to be more in direct collaboration to get people thinking about technologists in different communities. So that is happening. I think and the reason why I say that is, I was a English teacher and a history teacher. And my dear colleague often would say, my colleague Lisa K. Solomon would talk about the fact that we actually research the past, but we don't research the future. And so for young people, there's this like in education, there's this like axiom, if you will, that says like educators must prepare young people for a world that does not exist. I've heard that, right? How many times have we heard this? Like I don't even, it's like a tagline for any conference, right? And it's like, okay, thank you so much. I don't know how to do that. And I think where I got excited about the futures work is because it's not about preparing young people as if we know how their lives are going to unfold. We can never do that, right? Because they will surprise us and the world is changing. And so we can give folks some, I think literacy and numeracy are fundamental rights. Like we do need to make sure they have a literate public. Those things we need to get right. But I do think we need to build, again, capacities for young people to shape their futures. And that's a very different sense of agency. That's entrepreneurship, that's seeing trends, that's noticing signals. And that is where we actually should be leaning into, not trying to overly predict young people's lives if we know how it's going to happen. And so that to me is probably the thing that I'm most excited about and probably most aligns to the story that I told at the beginning of this call, which is not overly or underestimating the capacity or over predicting the lives of young people.
Well, Laura, this has been a wonderful conversation. I've had several of these, and each of our guests has a different perspective. And I really like how you brought the concept of innovation at the staff level to the
Yeah.
conversation. We've talked a lot about school reform, we've talked a lot about governance and having structures. You need structures, right? You need a system.
Yeah.
We've talked a lot about, tapping into empathy, which is very important in understanding people where they are. But
Yeah.
taking it to that next level of empowering people to be creative and innovative and to translate that empathy and responsiveness into
Yeah.
people putting in place practical
Yeah.
solutions that they're proud of
That's
takes the
right.
work to the next level. So we really
That's right.
appreciate your contributions in that respect.
Oh, thank you so much, Dr. Perman. I mean, we've done this like positive deviance work in a lot of different places. And I will tell you a closing story. I was leading it with a colleague of mine down in San Jose, which is a local school. And they were wondering about how they teach certain pedagogies. It was about teaching different aspects of experiential learning or progressive ed, if you will, kind of design or project-based learning. And we did this whole like deep dive for the day. And we did empathy work with each other. And we started to unpack like, well, how do you teach this skill? Like, how do you teach critical? Like, people got into the weeds, right, of practice, if you will. And at the end of the day, and then people built prototypes. They started explaining what it is. And then we looked across the room, and there were about 60 or so prototypes that describe their behavior and their best practice. And the thing that I saw at the very end of the day was a teacher, a math teacher. He was like, I love all these because I know not only are they actually work with my kids. They're not working in some fundamental school that's nothing like them. These are practices that have had success with the students that I serve. And I think that is real. And I think as educators, all of us need to be really good at noticing and appreciating the difference when we see things that look different, but it's having a positive result. Then the question I ask is like, well, tell me more. Why is that working? Tell us more. And I think as we go into this next round of the next 5 years, I think it's going to be really important for all educators at any level to be sense makers, to be good at asking questions, and to bring, I think, this really fundamental empathy for the future that we need to have for the people that are going to live beyond us. So, yeah.
Laura, it's been a joy speaking with you. Again, thank you for sitting in and talking with us on Elevating Futures.
Thank you so much for having me.
When you show us what was trying